The world called him the King of Cool. They said he could hold a cigarette like it owed him money. They said his voice arrived in a room before he did, low, golden, unhurried. They said Dean Martin never sweated, never rushed, never let the mask slip even once in 40 years of spotlights. But on the night of March 21st, 1987, a man who had sung to presidents sat alone in a house in Beverly Hills with every light turned off. The phone had rung 3 hours earlier. A captain from the California Air National Guard had delivered the news in the clipped, rehearsed language the military uses when the unspeakable must be spoken. There had been a training flight, an F-4 Phantom II, San Gorgonio Mountain, weather conditions, no survivors. Dean Paul Martin, Dino as his father called him, was 35 years old. He was a pilot, a singer, an actor, a tennis champion. A son. Now he was a name on a manifest. The elder Martin had thanked the captain. His voice, witnesses later said, did not waver. He asked one question. Had they found the body? The answer was no. Not yet. The mountain was covered in snow and the wreckage was scattered across a cliff face at 10,000 feet. Dean hung up the phone. He did not cry. He did not call anyone. He walked to the bar in his living room, the same bar where he had taught Dino to pour a proper martini when the boy was 16. And he poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon. Then he sat in the dark and listened to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark the hours. A housekeeper who arrived the next morning said she found him in the same chair. The glass was empty. The ice had long since melted. His eyes were open, but he did not seem to see her when she spoke. Here is what no obituary captured, what no tribute show ever explained. Dean Martin had 7 children from 3 marriages. He loved them all in his distant, complicated mid-century way. Birthday cards with $100 bills tucked inside. Surprise visits between tours. Jokes that landed softer than they sounded. But Dino was different. Dino was the one who looked like him. People always said it. The same dark eyes. The same easy slouch. The same way of entering a room like he had already been there for an hour. When Dean watched his son walk across a stage, he was watching a version of himself that might have made different choices. A version unburdened by the immigrant hunger, the nightclub years, the Jerry Lewis wars, the slow weight of becoming an American myth. Dino could have been anything. He chose to fly. Dean never said whether that frightened him. He was not a man who named his fears aloud. But a lighting technician who worked the Atlantic City run of the Together Again tour in 1984 remembered a night when someone mentioned Dino's fighter pilot training. Dean had been the mid-joke, halfway through a bit about golf, and he stopped. Just stopped. His hand went to his pocket. He touched something there. A photograph, perhaps, or a lighter. And then he finished the joke as if nothing had happened. The audience never noticed. The technician did. He would think about that moment 3 years later when he heard the news about San Gorgonio. He would wonder if Dean had known something was coming. Not specifically, not consciously, but in the way fathers sometimes know things about their sons that they cannot say aloud. That was Dean Martin's gift and his curse, the ability to keep singing while something inside him quietly collapsed. He had done it when his first marriage ended. He had done it when the Rat Pack began to fracture. He had done it when Frank stopped calling for weeks at a time and no one would say why. He did it now. 3 days after the phone call, Dean attended a memorial service. He wore a dark suit. He shook hands. He accepted condolences with the same half-smile he had given to 1,000 interviewers. But those who knew him saw something else. His eyes had gone somewhere far away. Shirley MacLaine, who had known him since the 50s, later said she tried to embrace him at the service. He let her, but his arms did not move. It was like hugging a statue, she told a friend that evening. He was there, but he wasn't. The search for Dino's remains continued for months. The mountain gave up nothing. Dean did not ask for updates. He did not call the base. He did not visit the crash site. Some interpreted this as stoicism. Others thought it was denial. A few wondered if it was something darker. A father who could not bear to imagine what the snow had buried. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Dean Martin, the man who had made a career of never being caught off guard, had been ambushed by grief in a way he could not charm or deflect or sing his way through. For the first time in his life, he had no material. To understand what Dean Paul's death took from his father, you must first understand what the son had given. In 1965, when Dino was 13, Dean Martin was the most famous entertainer in America. His television show drew 40 million viewers a week. His records sold by the truckload. His films with Sinatra had redefined what movie stars could be: loose, irreverent, untouchable. But fame has a particular loneliness. Dean spent 300 nights a year on the road, in hotel suites that all looked the same, surrounded by people whose job was to laugh at his jokes. He missed birthdays. He missed baseball games. He missed the slow, ordinary afternoons that turn children into people you actually know. Dino never complained. Instead, he built a life that kept intersecting with his father's world without ever competing with it. He formed a rock band, Dino, Desi, and Billy, that toured as an opening act for the Beach Boys. He dated actresses. He learned to fly. He joined the Air National Guard. And every few months he would show up backstage at one of Dean's shows unannounced with that same easy grin. "Hey, Dad, sounded good tonight." A production assistant who worked the Sands Hotel in 1971 remembered watching Dean's face change when Dino appeared. The performing mask, the half-lidded eyes, the calculated slouch, would slip for just a moment. Something younger would surface. Something almost shy. "He looked at that kid like he was the only real thing in the room," the assistant said. And in that room, there was a lot of fake. Their relationship was not without friction. Dean had grown up poor in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of an Italian barber who spoke broken English and pressed pants for a living. He had clawed his way into show business through nightclubs where the owners carried guns and the audiences threw bottles when they didn't like the act. Dino had grown up in Bel Air. He had swimming pools and sports cars and a last name that opened every door. He was talented, yes, genuinely talented, but he had never known the kind of fear that teaches you to keep one eye on the exit. Dean worried about this, not out loud. Dean Martin did not worry out loud about anything, but a friend from the Friars Club remembered a conversation in the spring of 1979 when Dean, unusually reflective after a few drinks, had said something strange. "The kid's got everything," Dean said. "That's the problem." The friend asked what he meant. Dean looked at his glass for a long moment. "When you've got nothing, you learn to hold on. When you've got everything." He trailed off, shrugged, changed the subject. That sentence, the one he never finished, would return to people who loved him in the years after March 1987. What had Dean been trying to say? What had he seen coming that he could not name? The 1980s were supposed to be Dean's victory lap. The Rat Pack had reunited, or at least the surviving members had agreed to share a stage again. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and Dean announced a national tour in 1987. The tickets sold out in minutes. The press called it "Together Again." The audiences were ecstatic, but those who watched the rehearsals saw something troubling. Dean was forgetting lyrics, not occasionally the way any performer might after 40 years. Frequently. Whole verses would vanish mid-song. He would cover with a joke, a shrug, a sip from the glass that was never far from his hand. But the old ease was gone. A backup singer who worked the Chicago and Detroit shows that spring said Dean seemed like a man waiting for something. She didn't know what. None of them did. Then the phone call came. After the memorial service, Dean returned to the tour. Frank had offered to cancel. Sammy had offered to reduce the schedule. Dean refused both. "The show goes on," he told them. It was the kind of thing Dean Martin always said. It was the code he had lived by since Steubenville. But on stage, something fundamental had shifted. A reviewer in Chicago wrote that Dean seemed present in body, absent in spirit. The jokes landed, but later than they should have. The songs were technically correct but emotionally vacant, as if someone had replaced Dean Martin with a very good impersonator who had studied all the moves but missed the music underneath. Frank noticed. He always noticed everything, even when he pretended not to. Backstage in Detroit, 3 weeks after Dino's death, Frank pulled Dean aside. What passed between them was never recorded. A security guard standing in the hallway outside the dressing rooms heard only fragments. Frank's voice rising, Dean's voice staying flat. "You gotta let me in, Dog," Frank said. Dog, short for Dago, the nickname from the old days. Dean's response was too quiet to hear, but the security guard remembered what happened next. Dean walked away, not angrily, not dramatically. He simply turned and walked toward his dressing room, as if Frank had not spoken at all. Frank stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he lit a cigarette with hands that, for once, were not entirely steady. Something else was happening that spring, something that would only become visible later. Dean had started carrying a photograph. His valet, a man who had traveled with him for 15 years, noticed it first. It was a small snapshot, wallet-sized, of Dean and Dino on a golf course somewhere. They were both squinting into the sun. Dino's arm was around his father's shoulder. Dean kept it in his inside jacket pocket. He never mentioned it, never showed it to anyone. But the valet saw him reach for it sometimes, in quiet moments, touching the pocket the way a man touches a wound to see if it still hurts. It always did. The Together Again tour lasted 5 weeks. Dean quit on the 37th night. He called Frank from his hotel room in Chicago and said he couldn't continue. Frank, according to those close to him, was furious, not at Dean, but at the situation, at the impossibility of helping a man who would not be helped. "What do you need?" Frank asked. "Nothing," Dean said. "I just need to stop." He flew home the next morning. He would never perform on a major stage again. The industry tried to pull him back. Offers arrived daily. Tribute shows, television specials, one-night-only engagements at casinos that would have paid him more money than most people see in a lifetime. Dean declined them all. His representatives made excuses, health concerns, scheduling conflicts, creative differences. The truth was simpler. Dean Martin no longer wanted to be Dean Martin, the persona that had carried him through 5 decades, the effortless charm, the perpetual wink, the man who turned every disaster into a punchline, required a kind of energy he no longer possessed. The engine had run out of fuel. The pilot light had gone out. A neighbor in Beverly Hills, a woman who had known him casually for years, said she saw Dean in his backyard one evening in the summer of 1987. He was sitting by the pool, alone, staring at the water. She waved. He did not wave back. She wasn't sure he had seen her. She wasn't sure he had seen anything at all. This is where the story grows quiet. This is where we must speak in whispers. Because what happened to Dean Martin after his son's death was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was simply a man putting himself away, piece by piece, like closing up a summer house for a winter that would never end. He stopped going to restaurants. For decades, Dean had been a fixture at La Famiglia, at Chasson's, at the small Italian places in the valley where the owners knew to seat him in the back and keep the tourists away. After March 1987, he stopped appearing. The maitre d's would call his house. The invitations would pile up unopened. He stopped returning phone calls. Sammy tried. Frank tried. Old friends from the nightclub days tried. The phone would ring in the house on Linden Drive, and Dean would look at it the way you look at a telegram you already know contains bad news. He stopped watching his own movies. This was the detail that wounded people most. Dean Martin had always been the first to laugh at himself, at the drunk routine, at the Italian stereotypes, at the whole ridiculous machinery of celebrity. But after Dino's death, he could not bear to see himself on screen. A woman who cleaned his house twice a week during those final years said he had covered the television in his bedroom with a sheet. Like a mirror at a shiva, she said, like he was in mourning for himself. The grief expressed itself in small surrenders. He stopped getting dressed. For a man who had once been photographed more than any entertainer alive, this was its own kind of statement. The custom suits stayed in the closet. The silk shirts yellowed on their hangers. Dean wore the same bathrobe for days at a time, shuffling through rooms that grew darker as the curtains stayed closed. He stopped eating. The kitchen staff prepared meals that went untouched. His weight dropped steadily, 10 pounds, then 20, then more. Friends who visited were shocked by the change. This was not the Dean Martin they knew. This was someone else, someone diminished, someone fading. He stopped sleeping. Or rather, he stopped sleeping at night. He would doze in his chair at odd hours, the television flickering silently, then wake at 3 a.m. and wander the house like a man searching for something he had misplaced. What was he looking for? No one asked. Perhaps no one wanted to know the answer. That night in Atlantic City came back to people now. The night the lighting technician had watched Dean freeze mid-joke when someone mentioned Dino's flying, the way his hand had gone to his pocket, the way he had touched whatever was hidden there. It made a terrible kind of sense in hindsight. Dean had been carrying a fear he could not name, a premonition perhaps, or simply the knowledge that every father carries about the fragility of the things he loves most. He had rehearsed this grief without knowing it. He had been saying goodbye for years, one silent pocket touch at a time. Now the goodbye was permanent, and Dean had no more rehearsals left. Frank Sinatra did not give up easily. He was a man who believed problems could be solved, with money, with connections, with the sheer force of his personality. He had pulled strings for presidents. He had rescued careers with a single phone call. Surely he could rescue his oldest friend. He arranged a dinner at his house in Palm Springs. Dean agreed to come, then canceled at the last minute. He arranged tickets to a boxing match, the kind of event Dean had always loved. Dean declined. He showed up at Dean's house unannounced, the way they used to do in the old days, and found Dean sitting in the dark at 2 in the afternoon. The curtains were drawn. The air conditioning was set too cold. Dean was wearing a cardigan over his bathrobe, as if he had been cold for months. "Doug," Frank said, "this isn't living." Dean looked at him. What passed between them in that look was 40 years of friendship. The women, the stages, the jokes that only they understood, the fights that never lasted, the silences that said more than words. "I know," Dean said. He did not say anything else. Frank left after an hour. In the car on the way home, he was silent. His driver, who had been with him for 12 years, heard Frank say one thing, almost to himself. "I can't reach him. No one can." Here is what must be understood about Dean Martin's grief. He did not merely lose a son. He lost the version of himself that believed things would be okay. Dean had survived poverty. He had survived the collapse of his partnership with Jerry Lewis. He had survived 3 divorces, 2 career valleys, and the slow erosion of the world that had made him famous. Through all of it, he had maintained a fundamental faith, not religious exactly, but something deeper, that the universe had a sense of humor, that things worked out, that you could always find the angle, the joke, the exit. Dino's death took that away. A 35-year-old man, healthy and talented and beloved, had flown a fighter jet into a mountain in a snowstorm. There was no reason. There was no angle. There was no joke. The universe, it turned out, did not have a sense of humor. It was just random. And Dean Martin, who had built an entire identity around making randomness look like grace, could not absorb that lesson without breaking. The photograph in his jacket pocket. A friend who visited in late 1987, one of the few Dean would still see, said Dean showed it to him that night. Just held it out without comment, as if it explained everything. The friend looked at it for a long moment. "That's a good picture," he said. Dean nodded. "It's the last one," he said. "The last time we played together. I didn't know it was the last time." He put the photograph back in his pocket. He touched the pocket once, briefly. Then he changed the subject, and they never spoke of it again. Years later, someone would remember that unfinished sentence from the Friars Club, the one Dean had started in 1979 and never completed. "When you've got nothing, you learn to hold on. When you've got everything," now the ending wrote itself. "When you've got everything, you forget that it can be taken away. You forget that the universe doesn't care about your jokes or your charm or your 40 years of making people smile. You forget that a sun can vanish into a mountainside on a Tuesday afternoon, and no amount of fame or money or talent can bring him back." Dean had never learned to hold on to the things that mattered most, because he had never imagined they could disappear. In the spring of 1988, search teams finally recovered human remains from San Gorgonio Mountain. The snow had melted enough to access the crash site. What they found was partial, fragmentary, scattered by a year of weather and wildlife. But it was enough. Dino was buried at Los Angeles National Cemetery with military honors. Dean attended the service. He stood very straight. He wore a dark suit, the first suit he had worn in months. He did not speak. He did not weep. He watched the flag-folding ceremony with the fixed attention of a man who has decided that if he concentrates hard enough, he can stop time. A soldier extended the folded flag toward him. Dean's hands trembled as he reached for it. He pulled it against his chest like a man holding the last piece of something that was already gone. Then he walked back to the car, alone, and he did not look back at the grave. The last years of Dean Martin's life were a long, slow diminuendo. He lived until Christmas Day, 1995, 8 years, 9 months, and 4 days after his son's death. In that time, he released no new albums. He made no films. He gave almost no interviews. He became a rumor, a ghost, a name that people invoked when they wanted to remember what American entertainment used to look like. But he was not entirely alone. His daughter Diana visited regularly. She would bring food, knowing he wouldn't eat it. She would bring stories about her children, knowing he would listen but not respond. She would sit with him in the dark living room, not speaking, just being there. He wanted company, she said later. He just didn't want to talk about why. Frank still called. The calls grew shorter over the years, Dean's voice fading, his responses becoming monosyllabic. But Frank kept calling. Once a week, like clockwork, for 8 years. Most of the time, Dean wouldn't answer. Frank would leave a message. "Hey, Dag, just checking in. Call me back." Dean rarely did, but he saved the messages. A housekeeper found them after his death. Dozens of cassettes from the answering machine, all labeled in Dean's handwriting. Frank. He had been listening. He just couldn't find the words to respond. The television in his bedroom stayed covered until the day he died. The sheet had yellowed with the years. The screen beneath it had gathered a fine layer of dust that no one disturbed. Dean Martin had not watched himself perform in 8 years. Not the films, not the television specials, not the clips that still ran on late-night cable. It was as if the man on the screen and the man in the bathrobe were 2 different people. One of them had been the king of cool. The other one just wanted to rest. And somewhere along the way, Dean had decided that only one of them deserved to. What do we make of a man who could not recover from losing his son? There are those who would say Dean Martin's decline was weakness, that a stronger man would have found a way forward, would have channeled his grief into art, would have emerged transformed. But that is not how grief works. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is not a test of character. It is simply the price we pay for having loved someone completely, and some prices are too high to bear without breaking. Dean Martin broke. Not dramatically. He did not drink himself to death, did not make scenes, did not burden others with his pain. He simply withdrew from the world that had given him everything, because that world no longer made sense without his son in it. The photograph never left his pocket. When Dean died, it was there. That snapshot of 2 men on a golf course squinting into the sun, Dino's arm around his father's shoulder. The picture had been handled so many times that the edges were soft, the image fading. But you could still see their faces. You could still see that Dean was smiling. In the end, what Dean Martin left behind was not the records or the films or the television shows that made him famous. It was something quieter, the image of a man who loved his son more than he loved his own legend, and who proved it by letting the legend die first. The King of Cool, it turned out, had a warm heart. He just kept it hidden, the way men of his generation were taught to do, behind the jokes, behind the glass, behind the half-closed eyes that saw everything and admitted nothing, until there was nothing left to admit, until the grief filled all the spaces where the jokes used to be, until silence was the only language he had left. A home recording exists. Someone in the family captured the moment of Dean's last public appearance. It was a small gathering, a friend's birthday party in 1993. Dean had come reluctantly, wearing a jacket that no longer fit properly, his face thin, his eyes elsewhere. Someone asked him to sing. He shook his head. They asked again. He looked at the piano in the corner of the room. He looked at the people watching him, waiting, hoping for a glimpse of the man they remembered. And then, very quietly, he sang 4 bars of "Everybody Loves Somebody." Just 4 bars. His voice cracked on the third. He stopped. He smiled. That old smile, the one that used to light up stadiums. And he said, "That's all I've got, folks." Then he walked out of the room. No one followed him. Some nights stay with you. Not because of the music, but because of the silence afterward. Not because of what was said, but because of what could never be spoken. Not because of the spotlights, but because of the darkness between them. The darkness where fathers sit with photographs they cannot stop touching. In houses that grow quieter by the year, waiting for a phone call that will never come. Dean Martin waited 8 years. Then he stopped waiting. On Christmas morning, 1995, he closed his eyes in his bedroom in Beverly Hills. The curtains were drawn. The television was covered with its yellowed sheet. The photograph was in his pocket, next to his heart, where it had been for 8 years, 9 months, and 4 days. The room was very quiet. Somewhere, perhaps, a son was waiting. Somewhere, perhaps, there was a golf course with no shadows, where 2 men could stand in the sun without squinting, and the game would never end. Somewhere, perhaps, Dean Martin was finally warm.